The Revolutionary War was won, but a new nation had yet to be built, and before it could begin, it nearly collapsed at a cold camp in Newburgh, New York. It was March 15, 1783. General George Washington stepped before his officers, men who had fought, bled, and gone unpaid for years. Congress had broken its promises. Pensions were in doubt. Mutiny hung in the air. Washington spoke of honor, of the fragile new republic, but the room stayed tense until he reached into his coat for a letter and paused. He squinted at the page, then quietly said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown not only gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." The officers wept. The revolt dissolved. It was a moment that told you everything about what kind of leader Washington was and what kind of nation this might become. That is where our story begins. 9 months later, Washington did something almost no victorious general in history had ever done. He rode into Annapolis, where Congress was sitting, and handed back everything. His military commission, his army, his authority, all of it returned to elected civilian hands. Thomas Jefferson, delivering Congress's formal reply, called it a triumph of principle. A man who had conducted the greatest military contest of the age, who had held unlimited power, and chose to give it away. King George III reportedly said that if Washington truly retired, he would be the greatest man who ever lived. He did retire, and the fate of the United States now fell to Congress, a Congress that was almost entirely unprepared for the job. The United States in 1783 was not a nation in the way we understand it today. It was more like a loose alliance of 13 suspicious neighbors. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could declare war and manage foreign affairs, but it could not enforce taxes. It could not regulate trade. It could not compel the states to do anything. The states held almost all real power, and they liked it that way. The results were predictable. The country carried a debt of roughly $77 million from the war, money owed to France, the Netherlands, and American citizens alike. But Congress had no way to raise the funds to pay it. When it tried to implement a modest tax on trade, New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island all blocked it. The federal government was broke and powerless. Abroad, things were no better. Britain still occupied strategic forts in the Northwest, cutting Americans off from Western trade routes. Spain had closed the Mississippi to American navigation. Even France, the ally that had helped win the war, was losing patience over unpaid debts. Founding Father John Jay lamented that the United States had become, in his words, the sport of European politics. The one genuine success of this era was westward expansion. The Northwest Ordinances of 1784 and 1787, largely shaped by Thomas Jefferson, laid out a system for settling the territories that would one day become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Land was divided into townships and sold to settlers. Public schools were guaranteed, and crucially, new territories would eventually gain full statehood, equal to the original 13. It was a rare blueprint that actually worked. But no one could ignore the bigger problem much longer. By 1786, the country was in economic depression. Farmers in Massachusetts, many of them veterans, were losing their land to foreclosures. They had fought a revolution against tyranny, and now a different kind of tyranny, debt and court orders, was taking everything they had built. Led in part by a former soldier named Daniel Shays, thousands of men took up arms. They shut down courthouses. They marched on federal armories. Congress could do nothing. Only the Massachusetts state militia was able to put down the rebellion after months of small, bloody clashes, and only by February of 1787. 9 people died in Shays' rebellion. That sounds modest, but the political shockwave was enormous. It confirmed what many already feared. The system under the Articles of Confederation was broken. Common people were desperate enough to revolt, and the federal government was too weak to respond. Something had to change. Delegates from across the country were called to Philadelphia. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was about to begin. 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787. Among them, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and, persuaded to attend despite his reluctance, George Washington himself. Over 4 months, they hammered out a document unlike anything the world had seen. 3 branches of government, a legislature to make laws, an executive to carry them out, a judiciary to interpret them. Each branch would check the others, and every power not explicitly granted to the federal government would default to the states. The compromises required to get here were painful. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equality. The solution, a bicameral Congress, a House where population determined seats, and a Senate where every state got exactly 2. As for the question of slavery, enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation, a moral failure baked into the founding document. Anti-slavery voices pushed back, but not hard enough. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed the final draft. But the Constitution still needed ratification by 9 of the 13 states. The country divided almost overnight. Federalists argued the new government was necessary to prevent the republic from collapsing. Anti-Federalists warned it was creating the very tyranny the Revolution had just overthrown. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay published the Federalist Papers, a collection of essays laying out the case for the new system that still shapes American political thought today. Delaware ratified first on December 7, 1787. New Hampshire became the decisive 9th state on June 21, 1788, with one major concession demanded by several states: a Bill of Rights must follow. And it did. By December 1791, 10 amendments guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, the press, the right to a fair trial, the right to bear arms were enshrined in the Constitution. There was never any question about who would be the first president. Washington was elected unanimously and sworn in on April 30, 1789. He stepped into an office that was almost entirely undefined. There was no precedent for any of it. So, Washington created precedent deliberately and carefully. His decision to give an inaugural address became tradition. His preference for the title Mr. President over grander honorifics set the tone. When he chose to leave office after 2 terms, it established a norm that would hold for nearly 150 years. He assembled the first cabinet, Jefferson as Secretary of State, Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, Knox as Secretary of War. He built up the federal court system from almost nothing, establishing the Judiciary Act of 1789 and appointing John Jay as the first Chief Justice. Not everything went smoothly. 2 early military campaigns into the Northwest Territory against a formidable alliance of Native American tribes quietly backed by Britain ended in disaster. The second, at the Battle of the Wabash in November 1791, saw over 600 Americans killed. Proportionally, it remains the worst defeat the U.S. Army ever suffered in a major engagement. Washington blamed his generals, reorganized the army, and tried again. By 1794, the Battle of Fallen Timbers ended the Northwest Indian War. The Treaty of Greenville followed, securing American control of the territory. That same year, a test came at home. Western Pennsylvania farmers, furious over a new tax on whiskey, rose up in rebellion. Washington's response was swift and overwhelming. 13,000 militia troops, the largest force he had commanded since the war, and he rode at their head personally. The Whiskey Rebellion collapsed without a battle. The federal government had shown it could act. Washington's presidency was also the stage for one of the defining conflicts in American political history, the rivalry between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton believed in a strong federal government, a national bank, commercial expansion, and close ties with Britain. He founded America's first official political party, the Federalists, to advance those ideas. Jefferson believed almost the exact opposite: limited government, states' rights, an agrarian republic of small farmers, and a natural alliance with France. He and James Madison founded the Democratic-Republican Party in response. Hamilton's financial program was ambitious and largely successful. He consolidated the national debt, issued government bonds, implemented tariffs, established the U.S. Mint, and, most controversially, chartered the Bank of the United States in 1791. Critics, led by Jefferson, called it unconstitutional overreach. Washington disagreed and backed Hamilton. The two men clashed on nearly everything. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Jefferson celebrated it as a sister revolution. Hamilton saw it as bloody chaos. When France went to war with Britain in 1792 and called on America to join, Jefferson wanted to honor the old alliance. Washington refused. Trade with Britain was too important, and the 1778 treaty had been signed with a king the revolutionaries had since beheaded. Washington's neutrality proclamation of 1793 kept America out of the war and infuriated Jefferson, who resigned as Secretary of State later that year. Washington himself remained above the party system, but barely, and he warned in his 1796 farewell address that political factionalism was the greatest threat the Republic faced. Almost no one listened. John Adams won the presidency in 1796 by 3 votes over Thomas Jefferson. Under the rules of the time, Jefferson, in second place, became vice president. 2 men from opposing parties sharing the executive. It was an experiment that failed almost immediately. Adams inherited a simmering crisis with France. French warships were seizing American merchant vessels. Adams sent a diplomatic mission to Paris to negotiate. What came back was an insult. French officials, listed only as X, Y, and Z, demanded a large personal bribe before any talks could begin. Adams kept the details private at first. Jefferson, suspecting a cover-up, forced the documents into the open. It backfired spectacularly. The American public was outraged. Pro-French sentiment collapsed almost overnight. Congress authorized the Navy to engage French vessels. The 2 nations were at undeclared war at sea. Adams, fearing that French sympathizers at home might destabilize the country, pushed through the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. The Alien Acts allowed for the deportation of foreigners without trial. The Sedition Act made it a crime to publish, and the definition was conveniently vague, false or malicious statements about the government. 25 people were prosecuted, including sitting members of Congress. Jefferson and Madison secretly drafted the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, asserting that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws, a doctrine that would echo all the way to the Civil War. The acts destroyed Adams' popularity. What was meant to protect the Republic had the look and feel of tyranny, and the upcoming election would make that clear. Thomas Jefferson won the election of 1800 with 73 electoral votes. He tied with his own running mate, Aaron Burr, a flaw in the original system that required Alexander Hamilton, of all people, to intervene and break the deadlock in Jefferson's favor. It was a bitter irony Hamilton would not forget. Neither would Burr. The peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, something virtually unheard of in the world at that time, was itself a kind of miracle. Jefferson called it the Revolution of 1800. He arrived at his inauguration on foot, in plain clothes, and moved into a White House that still had muddy roads and unfinished walls. True to his principles, he immediately began dismantling the Federalist Project. repealing the Naturalization Act, letting the Alien and Sedition Acts expire, slashing spending on the Army and Navy, eliminating the whiskey tax. He wanted a smaller, quieter government. For a few years, he largely got one. Before leaving office, Adams had rushed through dozens of last-minute judicial appointments, the so-called midnight judges, to pack the courts with Federalists. Jefferson told his Secretary of State, James Madison, to simply refuse to deliver the appointment letters. One of those appointees, William Marbury, took the matter to the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Mark Marshall delivered a ruling of breathtaking cleverness. Yes, he said, Madison's refusal to deliver the commission was illegal, but the section of law that gave the court authority to hear the case in the first place was itself unconstitutional. So the court ruled against its own jurisdiction, which meant it could not force Madison to act, but in doing so, it quietly claimed something far more significant: the power of judicial review, the power to declare any act of Congress or the executive branch unconstitutional and void. Jefferson won the battle. Marshall won the war. Judicial review has been the basis of the Supreme Court's most consequential decisions ever since. And then came the deal that no one had planned for. Napoleon, perpetually short of money and having lost his most valuable American colony in Haiti to a successful slave revolt, made a staggering offer. All 820,000 square miles of the Louisiana Territory for $15 million, roughly 2 cents an acre. Jefferson was in a genuine bind. He'd spent his entire political career arguing that the president should have no power beyond what the Constitution explicitly granted. Purchasing new territory was nowhere in the document. Accepting Napoleon's offer would be an obvious overreach of federal power, the very thing he had accused Hamilton of. He bought it anyway. Prudence, he decided, outweighed principle. The land that would become 15 future states, Missouri, Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and more, became American territory on December 20th, 1803. The United States doubled in size overnight. It was perhaps the most consequential real estate transaction in history, and Jefferson knew it. It contradicted almost everything he claimed to believe about the limits of government. Sometimes the right decision is the one that breaks your own rules. In the span of roughly 20 years, from Newburgh to New Orleans, the United States had gone from a fragile experiment on the edge of collapse to a continental power with a functioning constitution, an independent judiciary, a two-party political system, and a territory twice the size of its original 13 states. It had done so through compromise, contradiction, and occasional brilliance, through men who distrusted each other and sometimes distrusted themselves, through a system designed not to produce perfection, but to survive imperfection. The seeds of every later conflict over slavery, states' rights, the limits of federal power were already planted. But so was something harder to name: the habit of peacefully passing power from one hand to another, of arguing loudly and then going on. That, more than any treaty or purchase or battle won, may be the most remarkable thing they built.